authority there. Other businesses have other compliance requirements they have to fulfill. But the ones that are typically found, especially that are data center related in Europe, are ISO 27001-2, it's the SAS 70, it's the SOX, the PCI compliance standard, and in the UK, particularly for public sector, the N3 is a very important standard which allows a public sector organization to store data with a supplier if they have data centers that are N3 compliant. So again, you need to do a bit of homework, you need to ask the right questions, you need to know yourself first what you need to comply with, and in large organizations that's sometimes rather problematic. But in general we can say that compliance, the more likely you will get through internal compliance or IT security through these bodies if you want to use a certain external solution. If you have something that is missing, again, I would recommend talk to your supplier. Tell them exactly what you would want, why you would want it, what requirements you have, and they may come back to you and say, sorry, we can't do this, but sometimes they may already have plans in the pipeline they could pull forward, or maybe even if there's certain commitment from yourselves that they would actually do specifically for you. So it's always worth asking the questions if something is clearly missing that you need. At the other end, if you're part of an enterprise and you have extremely stringent compliance regulatory frameworks in place, you may want to ask the question internally, why is it we have to do this? Because in most organizations, cost pressure is massive at the moment, and compliance adds to the cost. So it's worth the question, do we really need to do this, or it's just there because somebody wrote a document a long time ago? Now there are some technical challenges too. One I found just recently with large organizations like the Swiss Post, they were probably not ready to go completely public cloud, but they were starting to build an internal private cloud. But if you look at some of the software solutions that are in the market for private cloud deployments, they really struggle if you want to integrate them into an existing legacy environment with firewalls, zones, VLANs, security environments, because many of these environments, they kind of either take over completely IP ranges, VLANs, and automate deployments of new resources, or they don't. But there doesn't seem to be something in between. So if you have maybe deployments which need to go into specific firewall zones, security zones, this can be so difficult that eventually you decide that you have to do it manually, and you cannot do it completely end-to-end automated. Some of the solutions, or most of them, they struggle to integrate virtualized and physical resources, because for some environments, let's say big, huge Oracle databases or DB2 databases, virtualized environments are still not always the best in terms of performance. But again, if you want automation, orchestration, many of these orchestration layers, they struggle to have physical and virtualized resources. I think as a very generic, general statement, storage is probably the biggest challenge, because you have this huge density in a virtualized environment, in a public or in a private cloud of virtual machines, that they require a lot of storage, IOPS, they need bandwidth, low latency, and so on, and you very often struggle to get that into the right SAN or network storage, network attached storage networks. So that's something just to be aware of, that many organizations really struggle with that. If you have a very complex environment, I'm more referring here to software, huge amount of different operating systems, any Linux, Polaris, Windows, every version that there is on the planet. Full automation becomes quite challenging, because you have to have loads of images and scripts and workflows in place. So the more you can streamline your environment, the better. And the other thing which I just came across in one of the recent projects, Fibre Channel over Ethernet looks like a pretty no-brainer from a technology point of view, But when we actually tried to implement and test some of the features, we realized that even in, let's say, the latest HPC 7000 blades together with Cisco switches 10 gig, some of the stuff wasn't actually properly tested, or nobody has had any experience. So we're walking into a bit no man's land there, where we have to kind of test stuff that works on paper, but nobody has really done it yet. And even some of the cards, the flex card for these HP blades, they just came out. It's not quite tested yet. It's maybe not even fully released firmwares. So there are a couple of areas with technology that is really required maybe in the private cloud that is not quite tested yet. So possible answers. Sometimes if you have highly proprietary application services, you may decide not to touch them because it's too much hassle. It's just too hard to make it work in the cloud. When you want to go to the cloud, whether you're looking at a public cloud or build your private cloud, again, it's important you have to do your homework. You need to know what you need in terms of storage, network, security. And when you write these RFIs, RFPs, make them very specific. You need to ask the right questions, otherwise you're in potentially for some surprises. A very good way to minimize the risks for projects, if you just insist with your vendor, you want to do a proof of concept. Maybe not for years and months, but for a specific period. And by doing that, you can then start to eliminate all the potential risks that they're hard to tell before you start the projects and actually test things and realize it's working or not. I think in organizations, especially public sector and enterprises, a very aggressive standardization is absolutely essential. You should standardize for one Linux version, one Windows version, one or two types of databases, and so on, middleware. Don't have a complete sprawl of different software technologies, because you cannot keep tabs of that. And in the cloud, it will just make things even worse. And I think sometimes we have to balance automation versus technical features. So you may not be able to do everything you want, but you may be able to massively improve your process, completely automate it. And it doesn't sound nice, but the reality is take out headcount at the operational level. And therefore, you may have to accept certain compromises and then maybe go in favor of process automation. Software licensing proves more and more to be an interesting area. Some of the software contracts are extremely long-term. If you look at Microsoft's VCD, it's typically over 36 months, and you have to determine over that period of time how much licenses you want, and it's typically peak levels. So that's very much against the flexibility, elasticity of the cloud, where you can move up and down, and it's really against that principle. But I guess with big giants like Microsoft, there is not much you can negotiate, especially if you go for these enterprise agreements. And some software is just very cloud unfriendly because they may charge you on virtual cores, although a virtual core is probably not as powerful as a physical core, and they just force you into this licensing scheme where physical and virtual are treated exactly the same. So I think what you need to do is, when you plan to virtualize, whether it's in your private data center, move to the cloud, when you plan to maybe go in a public cloud, you need to do your homework in the area of software licensing. You need to understand it. What licenses do we have? What vendors do we use? What are the impacts? If you're not sure, you need to talk to them and ask them specifically about what it would mean if you would move into a virtualized stroke cloud environment. You should challenge your suppliers, because some of them are just not willing to move because they see that their revenue streams are massively eroding. For them it's a threat. For you it's an opportunity. So challenge them, give them a hard time. Don't just give in when they don't give you the right answers. Now, one thing we found many people don't know, especially in the enterprise, is this SPLA licensing model. which is obviously something you cannot do as an enterprise, but if you go to a service provider can offer you SPLA-based licenses. Under the SPLA model, you can pretty much buy all the big brands now. You can buy Microsoft, Citrix, ArcServe, and many others. And I think many will follow that model, where you can buy license, where you can license software on a monthly basis. Which again, short-term commitment. You buy the licenses when you need them. If your project or your task force is finished, you can get rid of them and you don't pay. There's no long-term commitment. And I think in general, if you find that some of the suppliers are just not budging, you need to consider whether you want to ditch them and maybe look for alternatives. Issue number 8. In a corporate environment, that's a painful exercise I went through over the last couple of weeks with Swiss Post. Sometimes their finance model or their internal billing models are prohibitive to actually deliver cost savings to the internal customers. One we came across was they use internal data centers that are not very efficient, but because they've got the square meters, they didn't want to move out from an IT point of view to a co-location provider where we would have had a lot more flexibility and probably would have gotten the whole thing cheaper. But obviously from a group's point of view, if a business unit doesn't use the data centers anymore, they're empty and they don't save anything at group level, maybe at business unit level. So there was a strategic decision that we had to use the data centers, which are still more expensive than an external provider. So that was really hurting us in terms of how much we could save. Another area is if you want to aggressively maybe move into a new architecture, but you have quite a bit of hardware that is maybe 1 or 2 years old, it's not completely written off. If you want to write them off and replace them with something new, then that could mean major write-offs. And again, that's something we faced in the Swiss Post. I mean, millions of write-offs, and then new investments in modern technology like blades, which is not something that makes you very popular if you go to the board for that. Obviously, if you move out completely to the public cloud, and if you're willing to make that jump, then you don't even face these questions anymore. You may have to decommission a data center or parts of it, and that can be painful, but at least you have no new investments. What we found as well is P2V can be a major cost. What we counted, and that was based on many conversations with IBM and other business organizations that do large-scale P2V, and we found a typical P2V cost just for an application that you move into a cloud or virtualized environment is about 2 man days. Just imagine if you have a couple of hundred servers or maybe 1,000, you are talking about millions of costs. So while the operational cost might go down afterwards, but you still have to get there, and to get there you may have to invest a lot of money, and it can be expensive. And then the other thing we found, again in the case of Swiss Post and our football club, they don't have pay-as-you-go internal models. They use SAP and they have a fixed billing structure where they have units for a large server, a virtualized server, gigabytes of that storage type or backup. But they don't even have the concept of pay-as-you-go internally. So while we're able now to provide technology to these organizations that can do pay-as-you-go and you can meet it and measure it, but they can't deliver it yet to the customer. So they have to now change their internal billing model, and they have to change SAP in order to deliver these services to the customers, which is something, again, you cannot do overnight. Possible answers. I would say one thing I learned over the last couple of months, you need to understand the budgets in these businesses. You need to understand how they're structured. You need to understand how your customers are billed, and that's specifically in the public sector and in enterprises. Because if you don't understand how you build the customers, then you may build a technology solution that looks really cool, but ultimately doesn't provide benefits to the customer. You need to spend time with your finance people. They need to understand what you want to do. They need to understand what pay-as-you-go or utility billing means, so they can then start to adapt their finance systems in order to deliver these benefits directly to the customer. And you have to be prepared sometimes for nasty surprises, because we had a couple in one of the projects where they came totally out of the blue. It was something we didn't quite understand, which was within the finance realm, and it us, and it took us quite a while to recover. It was completely non-technical. It was a purely a business finance